Welcome to the Relationships Decoding Podcast.
Ever get that feeling, like a total gut punch when someone you're close to suddenly seems like a different person?
Oh, yeah.
I was talking to a friend a little while ago. She's usually so vibrant, the life of the party. And this time it was like someone had flipped a switch. All that spark was just gone.
Wow.
Turns out she was in the middle of planning her wedding, the whole shebang, and then boom, everything fell apart. Her fiancé was living a double life.
Oh, no.
It was rough seeing her so heartbroken. It really got me thinking about how deeply it hurts to realize you've been played in a relationship, especially when you're building a future together.
It's wild, isn't it? I mean, how such a fundamental betrayal can just completely shake someone's world. It's like their whole reality gets flipped upside down when the person they trust, completely turns out to have been deliberately deceiving them. It makes them question everything.
Absolutely. And it's not just about romantic relationships, right? It could be a friend, a business partner, anyone where you have that deep level of trust that gets shattered by deception. That feeling of being manipulated, realizing the reality you thought you were living was all just a carefully crafted illusion. It's got to be one of the most painful experiences out there. So if you've gone through this or you know someone who has, this deep dive is for you. We're going to really dig into what happens in those first devastating moments and explore the lasting impact it can have.
Yeah, for sure. So when we look at what's really going on here, it often comes down to something we call information asymmetry. The person doing the playing is intentionally creating or taking advantage of a knowledge gap. They've got the truth, right? But they hold back or twist it through lies by leaving things out or even subtle manipulation. This creates this false sense of security and understanding for the other person, making the eventual truth bomb even more devastating. What we're aiming to do today is break down those immediate reactions, both emotional and how it affects your thinking, understand the potential long-term consequences for how you see yourself and your ability to trust in the future, and most importantly, figure out some concrete ways to heal and recover.
Makes sense. So that moment when the truth comes out, for my friend, it was those messages she found. It can happen in so many different ways, that sudden shattering of what you thought was real. What goes on in those first moments? It's not usually a calm, rational response, is it?
Not at all. The immediate aftermath is usually like a surge of intense emotions. Imagine this. Your brain is suddenly trying to process this massive amount of information that just doesn't fit together. This often triggers what we call emotional overload.
Emotional overload.
Yeah, it's like you're hit by a tsunami of negative feelings, shock, disbelief, anger, grief, the works, and it's so overwhelming that it actually messes with your ability to think straight, even if just for a little bit.
Makes sense.
The amygdala, the part of your brain that deals with emotions, it just goes into overdrive.
Oh, wow.
And it can kind of hijack the prefrontal cortex for a while, which is the area responsible for rational thinking.
So it's like emotions are running the show.
Exactly.
We had this really powerful story from someone named Emily. She shared, "My mind just went completely blank. It was like all the circuits just blew. All I could hear was this super high-pitched ringing, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. Then this rage, just pure rage, washed over me. The next thing I knew, I was standing in my kitchen surrounded by broken pieces of a mug I'd smashed, a clothes rack had fallen over, and books were scattered everywhere. It was like my body just reacted before my brain even knew what was going on."
Wow.
It really captures that feeling of being totally overwhelmed, doesn't it?
It really does. And it shows how intense the connection is between the emotional and physical reactions. Alongside that initial shock and emotional chaos, we often see something called intrusive thoughts starting to pop up. What's really tough about these initial thoughts is that they often involve replaying the good times from the relationship. It's as if your mind is desperately trying to make sense of the betrayal by holding on to those loving memories you had together.
It's like what Sophie told us. She said, "I kept replaying these little moments in my head. The time he surprised me with my favorite sushi after a long day, or when he showed up at my door late at night with snacks just because I'd said I was craving something. Those memories just wouldn't stop coming back, and I couldn't understand it. How could someone who seems so caring do something like this?" It's like your brain gets stuck trying to reconcile two totally opposite realities.
Exactly. It creates a lot of cognitive dissonance, like a clash between the positive memories and the harsh reality of the betrayal. And as the initial shock starts to fade a little, we often see what's called rumination and narrowed attention setting in. This is where your mind gets fixated on the betrayal, replaying everything over and over, trying to find answers or figure out where things went wrong.
John described it like this. After I found out she'd been seeing someone else, I ended things right away, but I couldn't get this loop out of my head. Her face, the other person's face, bits of conversations. It was all just stuck on repeat. I couldn't focus on anything. I started missing deadlines at work, messing up simple tasks, and I just felt completely spaced out. It got so bad, my boss actually had to talk to me about it.
Yeah.
That sounds incredibly exhausting, just mentally draining.
It is. It's incredibly draining. That constant mental replay just eats up so much mental energy. It makes it really hard to focus on daily life, work, or even just taking care of yourself. The betrayal becomes the center of everything. And another common reaction in those early stages is emotional dysregulation, where people experience these unpredictable and often extreme shifts in their emotions.
We heard from Sarah about what her friend went through. She said, when my best friend found out she'd been played, it was like a storm. 1 minute, she'd be crying uncontrollably on the phone, and the next, when I got to her place, she was dressed up, talking about how she was going to move on and be amazing. Then, out of nowhere, in the middle of karaoke, she'd just burst into tears again, only to snap out of it a few minutes later like nothing happened. It went on like that for weeks. It was exhausting for both of us.
Oh, wow.
That roller coaster of emotions, it just sounds so destabilizing.
It absolutely can be. That back and forth between different emotional states, from intense sadness to this forced positivity and back again, that's really typical of emotional dysregulation in these situations. Some people might experience the opposite, though, like an emotional shutdown, where they just go numb and don't feel much of anything at all.
Interesting.
It's like a defense mechanism, a way for the mind to protect itself from more pain by just shutting down emotionally. But here's the crucial thing, and our sources really highlight this. When this kind of trust violation is so deep and personal, it can lead to something called betrayal trauma. This isn't just about feeling sad or angry. It can have really significant and long-lasting psychological effects that impact everything from how you see yourself to your future relationships.
Betrayal trauma. That sounds much deeper and more intense than just regular heartbreak. So we've talked about that initial whirlwind of emotions and reactions. What are some of the longer-term effects that can really stick around and shape someone's life after this kind of betrayal?
One of the trickiest long-term effects is this persistent self-blame and emotional scarring that can happen. Like you mentioned with your friend questioning if she was attractive enough, people who have been deeply betrayed often start blaming themselves. They start to question their own judgment if they're even worthy of love, and this can become a really ingrained and harmful way of thinking. Over time, it can seriously damage their self-esteem and even change how they see themselves.
Right.
They might start to believe that they're somehow flawed or destined to be betrayed again.
It's so sad to think that someone else's toxic behavior can create these doubts that linger long after the relationship is over.
It really is. And sadly, this can make people more vulnerable to getting into toxic relationships again later on. This is where something called repetition compulsion comes in. It's a term from psychology that describes this unconscious urge to repeat past traumatic experiences or relationship patterns. It's like the person is subconsciously trying to deal with the original pain by recreating similar situations, hoping for a different result this time. Unfortunately, it often leads to more hurt and reinforces those negative beliefs about themselves.
So even though consciously they want a healthy relationship, they're unconsciously drawn to that familiar pain.
Exactly. Another damaging long-term effect is how it can change their definition of love and what they consider acceptable in a relationship. After being betrayed, someone might, without even realizing it, start to see toxic behaviors as normal. Things that would have been huge red flags before might start to feel familiar, almost expected. This can lead them to either put up with or even unknowingly repeat similar unhealthy patterns in their future relationships, which just keeps the cycle of hurt going.
It's like the bar for what they'll accept in a relationship gets lowered, and they might not even be aware it's happening. And I imagine all this can lead to some pretty serious trust issues down the road.
Absolutely. Generalized distrust is a very common and totally understandable long-term consequence of being deeply betrayed. It creates this feeling of suspicion and doubt towards everyone. It becomes incredibly hard to build new trusting relationships, whether it's romantic or friendships. There's this underlying fear, like always being on guard, that anyone could hurt them in the same way, making it really tough to open up and believe in the possibility of a healthy, genuine connection.
It sounds really challenging, but it's so important to understand these long-term impacts so we can also figure out how to heal. So knowing all this, What are some of the most important first steps someone can take to start moving on and recovering after being played like this?
Well, the very first and most crucial step is to completely cut ties.
Okay.
As hard and painful as it can be, ending all contact, and I mean all contact with the person who hurt you, is absolutely essential for you to heal emotionally. Trying to stay friends or have any kind of ongoing connection often just keeps the wound open and prevents real healing.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like trying to recover from a physical injury while you keep hitting the same spot that's hurt.
Exactly.
So once you've created that distance, what's next?
After you've made that space, it's so important to give yourself plenty of time to process everything. Don't try to rush through the grieving process. Let yourself feel all the emotions that come up, the full range. Resist the urge to try and get closure or answers from the person who betrayed you.
Right.
They're often not able to give you real understanding or show true remorse. And trying to engage with them can often make things worse. Real closure has to come from within.
Closure really is an inside job, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And during this time, which can be really up and down, it's super helpful to practice what we call emotional first aid. When those intense feelings start to get overwhelming, use grounding techniques like deep breathing exercises to help calm your nervous system down.
Okay. Yeah.
It's also crucial to keep reminding yourself over and over that the relationship ending was because their actions, their lack of integrity, and not because of something wrong with you.
Yeah. That self-blame can be a huge hurdle to get over. What can someone do to actually break down those negative thought patterns about themselves?
It takes conscious and consistent effort, but you've got to stop blaming yourself.
Okay.
Whenever those negative thoughts creep in, the what-ifs, the if-onlys, actively challenge them. Look at the situation differently by focusing on the other person's choices and your own strength in dealing with a tough situation. It can help to write these thoughts down in a journal and then write down reasons why they're not true.
Oh, interesting.
Focusing on your strengths and picturing the possibility of healthier relationships in the future can be really powerful too.
And I imagine having support from loved ones becomes super important during this time.
It's absolutely essential. Reconnecting with your support system, those friends and family members who truly care about you, is invaluable. Sharing your feelings, even just talking about what you're going through, can be so comforting. It can help you feel less alone in your pain and give you valuable perspectives from people who care about you.
You mentioned earlier that true closure has to come from within. How can someone actively work on creating their own sense of closure?
There are a few things people find helpful. One is to write a letter to the person who betrayed you, putting down all your feelings, the hurt, the anger, the disappointment, but you don't send it. Just the act of expressing yourself without expecting a response can be really healing.
Okay.
Doing other things that symbolize letting go can also help, like having a little ritual to mark the end of the relationship or even getting rid of things that remind you of the person or the relationship. These things can help create a sense of finality.
They sound like powerful ways to take back some control after feeling so powerless. What about when the pain is too much to handle alone?
Seeking professional help from a therapist or counselor can be an incredibly valuable step. A therapist who specializes in trauma or relationship issues can give you a safe and supportive space to process all those complex emotions, develop coping mechanisms, and work through the long-term impacts of the betrayal. Some therapies, like EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, can be really effective for dealing with traumatic experiences like betrayal.
So it's a process, a journey of healing, not a quick fix. But once the healing starts, is it possible for this experience, as painful as it was, to actually lead to personal growth?
Definitely. Once you've started to accept what happened and the pain starts to ease up a bit, you can start turning that pain into growth. This means being honest with yourself and asking yourself some tough questions, like what did I really value in that relationship? What were the moments that hurt the most? And what did that teach me about my own boundaries and what I need in a healthy relationship? What do I learn about my own resilience, my ability to bounce back?
So using the experience, even though it was painful, as a way to understand yourself better.
Exactly. By understanding your own values, needs, and boundaries better, and by recognizing your own strength in going through something so difficult, you can move forward with more self-awareness and resilience. It's so important to remember, like we've been talking about, that being played doesn't define your worth or determine your future. With time, self-compassion, and a conscious effort to heal, it's totally possible to open yourself up to healthier, more fulfilling relationships down the line.
So to sum it all up, we've talked about how being deeply betrayed can trigger this intense and overwhelming emotional response with shock, intrusive thoughts, rumination, and emotional dysregulation. We've also looked at the potential long-term consequences, like blaming yourself, being more likely to end up in unhealthy relationships again, having a distorted view of love, and a general distrust of others. But the important thing is that we've also outlined some concrete steps towards healing. Cutting ties, giving yourself time to process, practicing emotional first aid, actively challenging self-blame, reconnecting with your support network, creating your own closure, and maybe even getting professional support. And finally, recognizing that even with all this pain, there's a chance for real personal growth and a brighter future.
That was a great overview. And one last thing to think about is that understanding the impact of being played goes beyond just your own healing. It can help you develop more empathy for those around you who might be silently dealing with similar experiences. Take a moment to appreciate the strength and resilience it takes to pick yourself up and move on after experiencing such a deep betrayal of trust.
Some really important food for thought.
Yeah, I think so.
Until next time.
See you then.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you next time.